Where does a tree get its substance? This is a question that my high school biology teacher asked our class now decades ago for me that I still remember. My teacher, Mr. Bachler, had us think about and write about the question, and I remember sort of grasping for the answer. Here's how I remember it going for me. Where does a tree get its substance? The soil, I guessed. That seemed right. The soil itself has substance and nutrients, and seemed intuitive that the tree would somehow absorb the soil to create the bark and the wood. Then why doesn't the level of the soil drop as the tree grows? Why aren't there big holes in the ground around the tree where the roots reach out, he asked. Try again. It's like, okay. Then maybe the water, I guess. Rain falls down into the soil, it gets absorbed into the roots and pulled up to circulate throughout the trees. Well, lots of water does circulate throughout the tree, he said, but 90% of the water absorbed through the roots is released out through vapor through the leaves. And anyway, how would water become wood, he said. Try again, Abby. Okay. By that time, even though I understood the basic biological processes of life, I was in biology class, I was feeling stumped and I was feeling kind of dumb, and I didn't want to make more wrong guesses. And so he said, the air. Where does the tree get most of its substance? From the air. Most of the biomass of trees comes from the air, or maybe more accurately from the air combining with water. And the water, we know, ultimately comes from the air as well. Where does a tree, a tall, solid trunk of wood, building material for most of our homes, the hard, long-lasting wood that most of us are sitting on right now or touching, most of us can touch wood right now. Where does it get most of its substance? From the invisible, intangible, untouchable, ever-present, and usually taken for granted air. And the biological process, for those of you who are trying to connect the scientific dots, feel free to zone out if you don't want to connect those dots, is simple photosynthesis. The plant's green leaves breathe in carbon dioxide from the air, its roots pull up water, and through combining with energy from the sunlight, it turns it into glucose, the simple sugar which becomes the building block for carbohydrates like cellulose that make up the main bulk of wood in a tree's trunk and branches. Turns it into glucose and into oxygen, which then gets breathed back out of the leaves. 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 6 water molecules, plus sunlight becomes a 1 glucose molecule and 6 breathable oxygen molecules. So if you're willing, if you feel comfortable, don't need to if you don't feel comfortable, how many of you were surprised when I said that most of the bulk of a tree comes from air? A lot of us, right? Even those of us who've technically maybe studied the science and maybe technically already know the mechanism of photosynthesis. I was talking with another colleague who's a minister now but had majored in biology in undergrad, and she was like, what? It's still counterintuitive for us. And I wanted to start with this today, not because the rest of this sermon is also going to be a biology lesson, but because it speaks to me of something similar in our own lives, of a similar truth in our own lives. If we look at the story of a tree, maybe even if we're looking at how do we grow a good tree, we often focus on what are ultimately smaller parts of the tree's story. Maybe the fertilizer in the soil, maybe the pattern of watering in the early years. Those are important parts of a tree's story, but the vast majority of a fully grown tree's substance arises from something that we can't touch, something that we can't really affect, something that is everywhere and also invisible to us. And a tree that is planted in a nurturing environment, in soil that suits it, in a location where it has good access to the sun, where it will naturally receive the kind of water levels that meet its needs, a tree planted in this kind of environment is more likely to do well. Over the course of our human lives, we tend to move around a little bit, more so than trees anyway. We find new friends, we find new workplaces, sometimes we find new cities or new religious communities. We're not bound entirely by the environment of our birth the way trees usually are. And the environments that we choose when we have that choice do matter in our lives. That's part of what is meaningful to me. But I believe it's also true that our stories, ultimately the story of our lives, are always larger than any of us understand. That the ways that we tell the story of our lives tend to hone in on small, even if they are important, but smaller parts of our ultimate story. Key events in our lives like a big love or a big loss. Key choices we've made like a choice of a career path or a choice to move away from our childhood home. The vast majority of the substance of our being arises from that which is more intangible. Surroundings, interactions, moments that we can't touch and that we often can't really affect. Substance within us arising from that which is everywhere and that which is also invisible. Our spiritual theme this month is story, and I've been thinking a lot about the ways that we understand our own stories, stories that others have told us about who we are, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. For example, I would bet, I don't know for sure, that when I started talking about biology and chemical composition of molecules a few minutes ago, many of you heard what I said through a lens of a story you have about yourself. Some of you are scientists, or some of you think of yourselves as scientifically inclined, or some of you were told that you were good at science in school, and you might have perked up. Maybe you were excited to think through the question of how a tree gets its biomass. Maybe, and let's be clear, this is probably true too, maybe some of you were skeptically listening to me because I'm a minister and not a scientist, and trying to catch my inaccuracies. I would bet that at least a couple of you were doing that. Some people perked up because you have a story that this is your thing, right? And I would bet that some of you who maybe struggled with science classes or who were told that you were bad at science, or maybe those of you who haven't thought about this stuff in decades, maybe you started to feel a little anxious, or you started to tune out, or maybe you started to feel a little bit bad about yourself or a little bit embarrassed, or maybe even a little unwelcome. Like, oh my God, this is a congregation where I have to understand and or care about the chemical composition of glucose in order to follow a sermon. Or maybe you pretended to perk up so that you could look interested because you didn't want the people around you to know that you were totally tuning out or that you didn't understand. Are one of those things true for many of you here? One of those stories. These stories about ourselves filter how we experience the world, even just a little moment like part of a sermon there. Even the simplest stories about whether we're good at something or whether we're bad at something impact so many moments of our lives, regardless of whether those stories are true. Because many of them are not true, right? No one is all good at anything or all bad at anything. When I was growing up, I was told that I was good at math and science. And I don't remember whether I was told that I was bad at language and writing. I don't actually have any memory of anyone telling me I was bad at them. But I definitely was not told that I was good at it. And beyond that, in my family, like in most families, my brother and I learned our stories about ourselves in part like in relationship to each other. So beyond not receiving praise from my teachers about my language and writing skills at school, I saw my brother excel in those areas. And somehow his success reinforced for me that those areas of learning were maybe other people's territory. Like maybe those areas belong to people like my brother, math and science belong to people like me. In truth, writing was not something, and is still not something that comes naturally to me. And some combination of that true inner struggle that I had with writing, and then the anxiety that built up every time I was asked to face into that internal struggle. And on top of that, all of the layers of stories that I took on about how I wasn't good at writing, those things combined kept me from saying yes to going into ministry for about 15 years after I felt called to the ministry. My thought process was something like this. I know ministry usually involves preaching. Preaching means writing. Writing makes me anxious. I'm probably not good at writing. I probably shouldn't become a minister. 15 years of telling myself that after I felt like maybe I want to be a minister, or maybe God is calling me to the ministry. My story about writing is so strong that it kept me from pursuing this vocation that I knew I was probably otherwise fairly well suited for, and that I knew that I probably would otherwise deeply love. I worked a lot of jobs that I wasn't well suited for in that time, and I avoided ministry mostly because of this story that I am bad at writing. In working jobs that I wasn't well suited for, and then not being successful in them because I wasn't well suited for them, there were times when I felt very down on myself. There were times when I struggled with depression. And I wish that I could say that at some point I just decided to confront that old story about myself, that I was bad at writing, in order to overcome it intentionally and internalize a new story for myself. And that is not what happened. I basically just ran out of every other job I could imagine doing other than ministry. And so I decided that I would go into seminary, and I thought, you know what, I can find maybe a chaplain job or some other kind of ministry job that's like not primarily about preaching. There's ministries that don't all have to be about preaching. I'll find one of those jobs. It wasn't until I actually took a preaching class, preached my first sermon, and heard from my peers and my professors in that class that maybe I wasn't bad at writing. Maybe I would be okay at preaching. That it occurred to me at all that this could be a story that wasn't true in my life. How many of you have avoided something important in your life because you have a story that you were bad at it? Yeah, almost all of us. How about you on Zoom? Yes. Yeah, I see. Maybe you have another experience where you experienced a trauma or a failure or a simple lack of luck in some area of your life and allowed another story to crystallize within you. I know so many people who wonder if their struggles with finding a healthy and lasting romantic relationship mean that something about them is broken, that they are doomed to be alone forever, that story has crystallized within them. I know so many people whose stories about themselves are still ruled by the insults of their abusive parents or cruel early teachers that were hurled at them as children and were never true. I know that our society tells incarcerated people in a million ways that the worst thing that they ever did in their lives should define the entire story of the rest of their lives. And how many queer people wrestle with suicidal ideation because religious leaders like myself told them that they were depraved or immoral or bound for hell. There are so many painful stories that circulate within us as a culture and certainly within us as individuals. Sometimes we know these stories aren't true and we can find liberation by letting them go. Sometimes, even when we know they're not true, it still takes a lifetime to change our relationship with those stories. And sometimes we don't ever question those stories. We don't question whether they're true because we believe them, and we just allow ourselves to curb our own joy or inhibit our own growth in order for that story to stay true for us. I'm not somebody who really believes that just telling ourselves positive stories, that like trying to manifest is how we solve all of our problems. If anything, I think the privileges and impressions that impact our lives due to our identities and our circumstances are, in essence, just big stories told by our wider culture that hinder all of us from fully thriving, regardless of our own personal lives, our own personal stories and choices. And some of our stories about ourselves are also beautiful, right? They're foundational, they're meaningful, even when they are maybe complex. Author Ozan Verrall writes, quote, "We all have stories we live by that aren't fixed truths. They're just old scripts we've been following without realizing it. If you tell yourself travel is exhausting, you'll only notice the hassles, the delayed flights and the cramped seats, and you'll miss the little joys along the way. If you tell yourself that you're awkward in social settings, you'll tense up before conversations even begin, and you might miss moments that could have been easy and fun. The point isn't to force yourself to love every rainy day or magically turn into an extrovert, he says. It's about just creating space to question the stories you've been living by and experiment with something new. You're not committing to anything forever, you're just saying, what if? What if this travel time was fun? What if I meet someone who's going to think I'm awesome at that party or at coffee hour after church? In other words, the work of changing those invisible stories that we allow to hinder our lives isn't usually about fully abandoning these stories, even if we wanted to. It's about opening some space. It's about just giving ourselves a chance to question how real the grip of that story is on our lives. It's about taking a chance to see what our lives might be like if that story wasn't true, or at least wasn't as dominant for us. In an episode of the Hidden Brain podcast, psychologist Jonathan Adler talks about how we can also retrain ourselves around how we tell the stories to ourselves, and that it can reduce our stress, it can build a sense of empowerment. There's even at least one study that it can biologically make us healthier if we retrain the way we tell our stories to ourselves. In our culture in the US, he says that we are captivated by what he calls a redemption sequence in storytelling. Has anyone heard about, I hadn't heard about it before I listened to the podcast. Redemption sequence. This is basically telling a story by saying something bad happened and then something good happened. It's a story of how we failed and then how we rose up from the ashes. Or it's a story of going through a difficult experience that taught us something so precious we wouldn't want to give it up, even if we had to take the difficult experience alongside it. This redemption sequence is in contrast with what he calls a contamination sequence, which is when something good happens and then something bad happens. So it's like a downward spiral, or a moment where an experience or relationship became tainted by or maybe even ruined by something at the same time. When we mine our life stories and look for ways of understanding these difficult experiences, and we all have difficult experiences in our lives, and we look for them as opportunities for rising up or opportunities for integrating and deepening something complex and beautiful into ourselves, our outlook in life can simply be better. We can be less stressed. We can feel more empowered. We might even be healthier. I think I said in benediction several weeks ago, maybe the week of the election, that if you stop almost any movie, almost any American movie, at least US movie, in the middle, it will be a mess. Whether it's a romance, the couple will have broken up. If it's an action movie, someone will be almost dead on the ground and hovered over by the evil villain. Almost all stories of US movies are awful in the middle. But the story is never over at that point. And our story is not over as a culture. None of our stories are over here in this space today, whether we're together on Zoom or together in our sanctuary. What I think is true is ultimately that we don't have power over all that happens to us in our lives. We don't have power over all of the gifts and challenges that come with us into the world when we are born, like these precious children we dedicated this morning. We don't have power over all of the opportunities granted to us by our culture, and more opportunities are granted to some of us than others. Some of our stories come to us by chance, some of them come to us by choice. But the negative stories that hinder us are not the only stories that we can tell. They are not the only stories we can tell about ourselves. Like the tree that experiences a drought in 1 year, its substance is built over many years. And even in that year of drought, most of what the tree has built came from the air, not from the lack of water. Even when we look at the hardest experiences of our lives, those hardest years of our lives, there are many stories we can choose to tell about those years or those moments or what is happening in our lives during those experiences. And so we can make space for a different story, and we can choose how we might find a way to tell that difficult story as a redemption sequence. Choose to tell ourselves what good might have come out of that story, even as we grieve and integrate the challenges. When the time comes when we can choose something that will impact our life story, when we do have those choices, it does also matter that we choose a nurturing environment for ourselves. It's easier to pull a meaningful and powerful and beautiful life story out of a nurturing environment. And so, my friends, may this community be one of nurturing for all of us who are here today, all of us who are in the wider embrace of this congregation. Especially may it be so for all of the children who are here. May our roots hold us close. May our wings set us free. May each of us choose to give our life story the shape of love and the shape of justice. May it be so, and amen.
Hi, I'm Reverend Abby Tennis, and I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Reverend Alexandre da Silva Soto, and my pronouns are they, them, and theirs.
And we are the ministers of the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where it is our mission to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world. We're so glad you watched this video, and we hope that its message connects with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for Zoom services Sunday morning at 11 a.m. or come in person at 2125 Chestnut Street, Center City, Philadelphia.
Whether you join in person or online, in these services you'll hear messages like you just heard. You'll get a chance to sing together, pray together, and even greet one another in coffee hour afterwards, whether you're brand new or a longtime member.
You can always find a Zoom link to our services and more about what to expect on Sunday mornings on our website, philauu.org, philauu.org. The link is below.
If you are connecting with this message and feel moved to give to the mission of this congregation, we invite you to click on the link below again and follow the prompts to give, or send a text message to 215-709-5095, and again, follow the prompts.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, please share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.
See you soon.